Well, the new report says democracy in Latin America is declining. Laintobarometro finds, the statistic is stunning to me, finds that 48% of Latin Americans prefer democracy over authoritarianism. Only 48%. You would think that would be 100%. That is the lowest level since 2001.
Yeah, Latin Americans are placing more trust in churches, the military, and the police over political parties. So for more on this, let's bring in CBSN contributor Willis Sparks. He writes for Signal, a newsletter produced by GZero Media. Good to see you, Willis.
Good to see you.
So why is this region so unsatisfied with democracy, given its history of authoritarianism that has existed in certain countries? Argentina and Chile, for example, come to mind.
Well, there's three reasons mainly things that people are upset about. Over the last 10 years, the economies in a lot of these countries have not really recovered from the financial crisis. So you're seeing growth slow down. Brazil, for example, went through the worst recession in the modern history of the country between 2014 and 2016. The economies are down across the board in a lot of Latin American countries. The second is crime. I've said on this network a couple of times, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela. Those four countries account for 1/4 of all the murders in the world. Crime is a very serious issue, and it's perceived to be a serious issue even in countries like Chile and Uruguay, where it's not as large an issue as it is in some of these more violent countries. The other factor is corruption. Public corruption, obviously, Brazil has been through a horrible political scandal, but corruption is an issue in a lot of Latin American countries. There are 18 former presidents and vice presidents that have found themselves in legal trouble over recent years. Now, one thing I do want to point out here, though, is the numbers are really striking for people who say democracy is not working in my country. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean they're ready to throw away democracy. And in fact, if you look at numbers of people who say, I wish we had authoritarian government in my country, that number really hasn't changed over the last 10 years. It's about 15%. But what really has gotten bad is the number of people who say democracy is not working properly in my country has gone from 51-44 10 years ago, saying it's not really working, to 71-24 saying it's not working. A 20% spike in the wrong direction. One other factor here, I think, you asked in your question, hey, there's a history of authoritarian rule here that we need to be aware of. Brazil, coming back to that country, they were ruled by the army from 1964 to 1985. There's a whole generation of voters who are not old enough to remember that. And if you look at the breakdown in the Laintobarometro poll, older voters like democracy better, and they're more suspect of authoritarianism. Younger voters who have never lived in an authoritarian country are more likely to say, well, look, I don't necessarily want a dictator in my country, but democracy is clearly not working. So actually, I'm just not going to participate. I'm not going to vote at all. It's really a story about people checking out on democracy more than it is on, please find me a military dictator that I can follow.
That's interesting, because my question was going to be, how does this feeling manifest itself in real life? We sort of alluded to Brazil electing a very far-right candidate, but what are we seeing in some of these countries?
Deep cynicism. Yes, Brazil has just elected a far-right president. Mexico has elected what some people consider to be a far-left president, Mr. López Obrador in Mexico. So it's not really a left-right thing. Actually, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and López Obrador in Mexico are two guys 10 years ago really would not have been taken seriously in the same way that, hey, they just won elections. Yeah. So neither of these guys are going to steer their country toward authoritarianism. In fact, in Mexico, López Obrador wants to have more referendums. But 10 years from now, where are we going to be? That's, I think, what we should be worried about, maybe even 5 years from now.
Really quickly, because we want to hit hard numbers, but I have a question. Why is it that people have short-term memories? I've seen this in, for example, in Haiti, where people, when Duvalier came back to the island to live out his final years, there were many Haitians who seemed to forget how brutal that dictatorship was, and they said, you know, we need a guy like Duvalier running the island again. You see people in Iraq saying that when Saddam was in power, things were better. Why do people have short-term memories?
South Africa, there's a whole group of people that think of the ANC as the party of power, not the party of liberation.
Right.
I really do think it's just another generation of people that do not have the same historical experience as their parents. And yes, we do have short-term memories because now the way we get our information is really geared toward the news cycle in a way that it wasn't even 10 years ago. So I think that there is a shortening of the attention span that goes on as well.
All right, we're going to hit up hard numbers. Let's start with 25, the first one.
25, Turkey is a country that has had a lot of economic distress recently. It's obviously a very important country in the world for a lot of reasons. Inflation in that country hit 25% in the month of October, which is important because they're headed towards some fairly important local elections in the spring. So this is exactly what President Erdogan really wants to avoid, is more sign of economic distress right before his party has to face voters again.
16.
Well, satellites photographs are telling us that there are 16 test sites where ballistic missile testing is going full speed ahead in North Korea. So, yeah, they may be dismantling or maybe dismantling, partly dismantling, planning on dismantling a site or two. But the worry here is that President Trump is so invested in claiming that his North Korea policy is a success that we're not noticing the fact that actually the North Koreans are cheating all over the place.
Not noticing or willful ignorance?
I know.
Or maybe just not deliberately not looking.
I mean, just today, John Bolton said, summit number 2 coming up.
But you can photograph this from space. And we are photographing it from space, and it's really something to keep an eye on.
Wow. And 4.
4, that 4% is the growth rate of the population of cities in Africa. This is part of a broader trend that we see in emerging markets where people move from the countryside to cities. But in Africa, it's different. We're not seeing the growth of a middle class because of a growing urban population. First of all, a lot of this population growth, this 4%, is just natural growth of the population of people already in cities. But the real worry is that in a lot of African cities, people are not getting good jobs and joining the middle class. They're falling into the informal, off-the-books economy, and a lot of these cities are becoming incubators for anti-government feeling and protests in a way that is different than the pattern that we've seen in China and India and some other emerging market countries.
Oh, that's very interesting. Willis Sparks, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Of course, you can check out all of these stories and more by subscribing to the Signal newsletter. Just sign up for it at GZeroMedia.com.